Our first question, please.
Jim Marshall, are we witnessing the death throes of Western capitalism?
I'm going to bring in, everyone wants to come in again, but I'll just bring in, first of all, Douglas Murray.
First of all, very briefly, no, it's not the death throes of Western capitalism, not least because, I mean, what are the alternatives? All of the alternatives to a capitalist economy have shown themselves to be moribund and disastrous, and I think that capitalism certainly hasn't shown that. Look, I mean, the other thing to say, it's not just the banks, of course. It's about nation after nation spending beyond its own means. It is why we've not only got the crisis in the Eurozone, but the crisis in America over the debt ceiling there. We have been spending far beyond our means, and we're doing it in Britain as well. And, you know, the problem is that this is all becoming, as always, a political football. And nobody wants to announce cuts that are needed because they fear the electoral response for that. That's why Berlusconi, again, has just delayed the necessary cuts in borrowing in Italy because he wants to put them off till after the next election. Now, I mean, I think this is grossly irresponsible. And just very quickly on the tax payment thing, this is true. People have to pay taxes, but I mean, in Scotland, unfortunately, just over half of voters pay taxes. That's a terrible level of taxpayer responsibility. And so of course there are problems around Europe. Of course there are problems in America, but there are problems at home as well we have to deal with.
That's a terrible indictment of poverty in Scotland and a poverty that's been imbued for generations. I would love a situation in which Scotland was a wealthier country and more people paid tax. We have to overcome the legacy of misgovernance in Scotland under the Union for a whole period of time.
Rory Stewart.
On the Western capitalism point, I think we need to be very, very aware of the fact that we're now very dependent on China and Brazil. And as Gisela said, China is, of course, dealing with very, very complex problems. And Brazil now has an overvalued currency. It's very, very reliant on oil and gas exports. So we should not get ourselves into a deluded situation of believing that even China and Brazil are safe and that we can indefinitely continue to grow off their back.
Jim Marshall, you put the question. What's your thought?
Well, although the panel are very articulate, I don't really feel that they've got the answers here, because I feel that if politicians had the answers, we wouldn't be in this mess that we are today. And it's been all downhill since the collapse of the banks a couple of years ago. We're heading for a double-dip recession. The politicians just don't know what to do. They're totally mesmerised. Those politicians that are not in the pocket of Rupert Murdoch, that is. So I'm sorry, but I haven't really been satisfied with the answers I've had from
Rory, can you very briefly help Douglas Murray?
Well, as the only non-politician on the panel, of course politicians don't have all the answers, and sometimes I think, as in this case, they are hampered in some of the answers. As I say, again and again we come across this problem. It's a democratic problem, and it's now affecting the markets and affecting our economies, which is that there are, across Europe and in America, cuts that need to be made, but they are hugely unpopular with the public, so the politicians tell you something different from the things they know need to be done. And until the public address some of these questions, and until the public have some of this explained, as it were, and that there is a lie going on in our political system. You cannot keep on spending beyond your means as a country any more than as an individual or as a household, and we have to deal with that.
Katie Powie, we've been hearing for months that Gaddafi can't last much longer. Are we even close to getting the rat into the corner?
Rory Stewart.
I think it's going to be, and this is something which I think is me speaking personally rather for the party, I think it's going to be difficult. We've been hoping against hope that somehow we can continuously increase pressure on Gaddafi. The reality is that I think our understanding of the internal dynamics of Libya is much more limited than we like to acknowledge. A lot of the divisions between the west of the country and the east of the country we've underestimated. And I would have thought that Gaddafi ultimately would go. But people who say he's necessarily going to go in a few days or he's necessarily going to go in a few weeks, I think are being over-optimistic. And the real problem is that even when he does go, I'm very, very uncertain about what happens next. You end up holding the baby. You end up responsible for Libya. How on earth do Western countries take responsibility for a country of 6.5 million people on the edge of the Mediterranean when Gaddafi goes, and where do we think we have the lessons to apply to that country?
Do you think it was premature, given what you just said, for the government to say that they no longer recognise Gaddafi, but they do recognise as the sole governing authority the rebels, who some analysts think of as a very disparate group? And of course General Yunus was assassinated, their leader, apparently by one of them.
I think in the end the logic of what we did out of the back of that UN resolution were going to lead us to recognise the rebels. It no longer made any sense to continue to recognise Gaddafi and deal with Gaddafi's diplomats when we had set ourselves so clearly against him. It moved from protecting the civilian population in Benghazi to quite an explicit desire to topple Gaddafi. Recognition of the rebel government was a necessary part of that.
Would you have, you have the benefit of hindsight, but perhaps even without the benefit of hindsight, would you have gone into Libya or had the UN resolution and used it in the way it's been used?
With the benefit of hindsight, I would say that we should have focused on the protection of the civilian population in Benghazi. We get into a very black and white world where we imagine we either do nothing or we have to topple the dictator. I would have liked us to say we're in the business of a no-fly zone. We achieved that in 48 hours. We destroyed all Gaddafi's planes in 48 hours. We're here to protect the civilian population of Benghazi, and if people say to us, Gaddafi's still there, we should have the confidence to say, yes, but that isn't what we signed up to do. We signed up to protect a few thousand lives. It's something like sanctions. It's an international measure that we've done in northern Iraq and the Balkans, and we're not going to be measured on whether or not Gaddafi falls.
Douglas Murray.
Well, of course, nobody wants to go in blind to anything like this, and I don't think that our government or any other did. But I think we have to look at what the objectives are, what we would like to achieve in this. The first one, as I think everyone here agrees with, is the necessity of protecting populations from genocide and from slaughter. That's something actually that the operation has had some success in, some considerable success. It isn't nothing in Benghazi to have been saved from the mass onslaught of Gaddafi's forces on the civilian population. So
is that for you on that first point? Is that for you a universal governing principle, or does it apply in individual cases? I mean, everyone has had in mind, of course, what's happening in Syria, for example.
Well, let me get on to that in a second, if I may, because the second thing that seemed to me, and I diverge from others on this, is that whilst you're there, a very good outcome would be to get Colonel Gaddafi out of power, either by toppling his regime or making sure that you get a missile strike on him. Now, the UN resolution didn't allow for that, so it seems to me that one of the most important reasons to be there is something we can't do. But the third reason is the crucial one, that one of the reasons why it was so important to go into Libya then was at that moment and now, when leaders across the region are, for the first time in history, at peril of popular uprisings from their own people, not military coups, but popular uprisings. We needed to send, and should be sending, a very strong signal to people like Assad in Syria when they start doing the same to their populations. And this is, to me, the tragedy of what is happening at the moment, which is that instead of this being a good precedent of showing that the West and Western countries will be tough with dictators who start to massacre their own people, we have lost our deterrent. Assad knows that we will not go in and do anything. It doesn't even need William Hague to say it, as he did the other day. It doesn't even need Hillary Clinton to keep saying that he's somebody you can do business with. We have lost our deterrent, and as a result, any dictator in the region, instead of fearing the results of genocide, will think they have nothing to lose. And I think that's a disaster.
I think the challenge for Gisela and for Douglas is that, of course, it's true that there is a real symbolic value in showing that we don't allow oil-rich dictators to murder their population. But we have another problem, which is that there is a limit to what Europe can do. We don't have the full backing of the United States here in the way that we'd like. Our options are limited. We need to learn how to be more moderate. We cannot get into a black or white world where we feel either we do nothing or we reshape the world in our image. We need to be much more responsible about realizing our knowledge is limited, our power is limited, our legitimacy is limited, and thinking how we can use things like sanctions and no-fly zones in a limited way, and not getting in a world where you dip your toes in and then get sunk up to your neck.
On that last specific point, that you dip your toes in and get sunk up to your net if you're not careful, and that's even worse than going in there and failing.
Yes, I mean to my mind, it would be a disaster if at the end of all this, Gaddafi remained in power. It would embolden, as I say, any dictator in the region. But just on this thing of what the criteria are, I mean, I go back to, I quote Tony Blair on this one. He said before Iraq, he said, of course there are all sorts of dictators around the world you would like to get rid of. He said, I can't. But he said, when you can, you should. And there are circumstances that arise, and I think Libya is one of them, where an extremely unpopular leader in the region, unpopular with all of the Arab League, a deep wound on the international community who had sponsored terrorism for decades, and apart from anything else, let's not forget, brought down an airline over Scotland through his terrorism. It was an opportunity, and should have proved a very good opportunity, to finally get rid of this man, and I think we're losing that opportunity.
Quick last word,
I think the problem with Douglas's analysis is that if you overreach, if you try to do things you can't do, that is just as dangerous for your credibility as not doing anything at all. We must take on the lesson that ought implies can. We do not have a moral obligation to do what we cannot do, and if we pretend to do things we can't do, we end up humiliating ourselves in the eyes of the world.
Of course, let's not take on any failing mission.